stream.
Hey, we're live. Look at that. So
how did that happen?
I clicked the button.
Oh, wow.
So we're going to talk about time tonight. Time is a resource, not necessarily a resource like in-game, though it is.
It can be. Depends on the game.
Yeah, and this sort of...
And actually, I'm sure that the conversation is going to move into that territory in some ways, too, because we're going to be talking definitely about Shadow Dark.
Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well.
Yeah, okay.
But at the same time, it's... yeah, I imagine that's probably going to be one of the biggest ones that we talk about, as well as Blades in the Dark.
Mm-hmm.
It's something to do with all those dark games, man. What's that?
I said, what's up with that?
I don't know. Probably Tin Candles too, just because I love that game and it's freaking genius.
Yeah,
and,
it is. And so the way that this came about is that we were talking about Broken Empires, right? Me, myself, and Dai's new Kickstarter game.
Yeah, that was the kind of the instigation of the conversation, if I remember.
Yeah,
right.
that's what kicked it off. And you, I mean, I kind of want to let you just go for a moment because I don't feel like I'm not going to explain it as well as you did. This is something I don't. So, did it occur to you as we were discussing, or is this just
this is
something that you've thought of before that became relevant as we were discussing the Broken Empire?
I think, I mean, I've been thinking about game design for a long time in various aspects, but I think that when we were talking about terms like rules light, what that actually means, I was like, well, and it just kind of clicked for me. So this is all going to be a fairly new discussion, I guess.
Sure.
You and I here really haven't talked about it specifically yet. We kind of were saving it for now.
Yes.
So, and a lot of this conversation, I think, is going to be developing the idea, whole stream of consciousness style. So it's not like I have a page of notes or anything, points I want to hit or anything specific like that. But it occurred to me while we were discussing gaming terms and what have you, that what rules light actually means is time light. When people say rules light, what they mean is this game doesn't waste your time. Like last stream, you mentioned one of my favorite phrases, which I think, if I recall correctly, one of the Gygax's original crew, one of their wives, watched him play, and she was like, "That looks like 30 minutes of fun packed into 4 hours." and I love that phrase because that's a very accurate way to describe certain sessions of RPGs. In a lot of cases,
yes.
And that depends on the system and how much the system respects the player's time. Or I shouldn't say that. What the game system thinks is important to focus on. Being that D&D came originally from wargaming, the crunch in the system revolves around combat. I mean, it just does. It's in its DNA, and people who try and make it do other things are, in my opinion, would be better served by going to a different system, honestly. Hey, BGD. Good to see you.
Hey, Mike.
Oh, and Mike's here too. Cool. And, there are people who will say, hey, you can do anything in 5e or D&D, get whatever version. And I'm like, okay, I guess theoretically you're right. Like, you can put it in any setting. But at its core, it is a combat simulator.
Combat board game is what I call it.
Yeah, combat. Yeah,
you're writingly, but
just like I think it's. I mentioned this as well before. I think it's Dave Thomavor who calls it. If you're playing 5e, it's like driving a mech. And you got all these all these buttons and dials and switches and all these things to keep track of, right?
Yep. And 5e is largely where you're playing a class, not a character, sort of comes from, at least from my perspective. Because there's so much to consider. Now, obviously, you can apply that elsewhere, but 5e is really where I feel like that system is the best example that I'm aware of.
I mean, it's once again, that's part of the DNA of D&D, all the way back at the beginning. Elf was its own class, right?
Yeah.
Halfling and dwarf were their own. Not the non-human races were their own classes. That's how they handled the special abilities.
But more so than that, it's like, because D&D focuses so much on combat because of its pedigree, you are reliant on your class's abilities in order to be able to perform in combat. And so instead, what would my character do, or what would who is this person that I'm currently inhabiting? What would they do? How would they express themselves in this combat situation? And it really is boiled down to, well, here's the list of abilities that I can perform. Which one is the best in this situation? I'll do that one. Which is why I say that it's a very good example of you're playing a class and not a character, because it very much feels
like driving a mech.
Exactly, you're driving a mech.
Hey, I'm driving my cleric mech now.
Right, and that doesn't mean that you can't role play in it. It just means that systems in the game are they're geared in a specific direction that sort of allows that particular style to,
manifest.
Great word, manifest. Yes, exactly.
So yeah, that is. I'm trying to remember now as we're talking some of the exact things that we said that started this whole train of thought in the first place. One of them was,
I'd honest to God have to scroll up through our conversations to get there, but man,
me too.
Miles of text.
But I remember saying at one point that I think that this is one reason why Shadow Dark has become such a huge and justly deserved hit. Is because it's a game that does not waste your time. But part of the reason why that's the case is because it actually mechanizes time as well.
Yep, it puts you on a
time. You have an actual, you want to have a 1 hour hourglass on the table, because that's how long your torch lasts, unless you put it out and then you can't see anything. So why would you do that? So not only does it not waste your time, but it puts time as your primary resource, essentially, both in character and out of character. The other game that I mentioned, Blades in the Dark, is a game which mechanizes time to a high degree and plays with time as part of the core mechanics. You literally have your jobs that you go on, and then you have your heists, and then you have your downtime as a separate game, almost a separate game system in a lot of ways. But also, when you're in a heist, you're popping into flashbacks all the time. That's also a resource, right? So your stress level determines how many times you can essentially flashback to describe why what you're doing is successful. Blades in the Dark is a genius game.
I don't have any experience playing it. In fact, I haven't even read Blades in the Dark yet. I own it, just haven't read it yet.
Oh, you should read it. It takes a while to wrap your head around, or at least it has for me, just because it's so very different than anything that came before it. Yes, it's a fork, if you will, off of Powered by the Apocalypse, but it's way more detailed, and the things that it does with time and the mechanization of time through clocks and making time kind of a fluid. Blades in the Dark is interesting because time is not fixed in the system. And what I mean by that is you're playing with scenes. You're playing with, how do I put this? Like I said, this is all kind of a new train of thought for me, so it's not terribly well formed. But whereas Shadow Dark is very kind of strict about time. Time is always progressing. It's ticking down constantly, and you always have to like keep that in mind, right? You have to.
Mm-hmm.
It puts a certain amount of pressure on you.
Mm-hmm.
That's why also in a similar way. That's why always on initiative is part of that, because that's also like, okay, if we're going to be keeping track of this constantly ticking clock, then we got to be efficient and we got to know who's doing what when. And so you roll up initiative, and then from that point on, as soon as you enter the dungeon, everybody just takes one action at a time in that order. Whoever wins the initiative is first, and then you just go clockwise around the table. Whereas with Blades in the Dark, you're actively choosing how and when to employ time via flashbacks, via clock progression, so that, and that's by the nature of the game, in that it's, I wouldn't call Blades in the Dark rules light. It's actually pretty. There's a lot going on, a lot to keep track of.
Do you want to maybe explore the ideas of how Blades in the Dark handles the clocks and flashbacks, just to, because I'm unfamiliar with it.
Okay.
And there may be other viewers who are unfamiliar with it.
So
well, I may be the only one, but I'm the one sitting here talking to you. So
no, that's fine. Yeah, I probably should do that actually for the benefit of, because like I said, Blades in the Dark is very different. It's a very different type of RPG than your typical combat simulator. So, hey Heath, good to see you. So Blades in the Dark has one of the I don't want to call it innovations, but it's because actually I think clocks, the way it uses them, were even used all the way back in like AD&D days. But they are integrated into the game system as an intrinsic part of it. And what they mean by a clock is all you do is you just draw a circle, and then you subdivide it either with a cross, so you have a four section clock, or you can do them 6 or 8 times, like the number of sections in the clock, right? Slices in the pie. It's like slicing a pie. And each one of those is not representing a particular progression of time. It's representing a particular progression of events. So, like, for example, you can have multiple clocks active on your character in downtime even. It's like, oh, hey, I want to research this particular alchemical substance, right? This alchemical formula to do a specific thing. Maybe I want to make smoke bombs or whatever it is. And so the GM's like, okay, that'll be a 6 slice clock. Go ahead and set it up. And then there are mechanics for how many slices of that clock you can fill in based on how well you roll during downtime. Same thing happens during jobs. Maybe you have an 8 slice clock. It's like, okay, you've gotten into the warehouse now, and there's an 8 slice clock for how long it's going to take the guards to come back on their shift, right? And there are certain things that are going to trigger. You could just have it, okay, it's going to fill in a slice every round, or there can be specific results in rolls, whether or not they're successful, that will fill in more, even maybe more than 1 slice on a clock at a time.
And PGD just mentioned Watchmen, the graphic novel, with regard to clocks. Is the idea that these clocks are counting down to something or counting up to something, or like, is it a way for the GM to sort of track events that are taking place elsewhere
Yes.
that maybe come. Okay.
Yeah, you can have clocks. You can have clocks for individual factions. It's like, okay, the Dimmer sisters are going to they need to acquire a certain amount of resources to do whatever ritual, and that's a 6-slice clock, say. And any time that they make progress towards that goal, they fill in one or more slices of that clock. And depending on, whenever the clock fills in, then something's going to happen, right?
Gotcha.
And you can, but here's the thing too: is it's not a fixed progression either, because you can have you have all the faction politics going on, especially in the downtime section of the game, and depending on how the players behave and what kind of goals and jobs they pull, goals they accomplish and jobs they pull, you can decrement clocks as well. It's like, oh, hey, the players just did a heist uh, on the Dimmer sisters' turf, and that brings their clock down 1 or 2 slices, say. So, so time is it's more like a concept, I guess you could say. No, that's not the right word. Time is more of a I don't know if I have the right word for it at the moment. But like I said, it's not so hard and fixed. It's kind of it's okay. Here's what it is. Time is at the mercy of the players, GM included.
Okay.
In Blades in the Dark, in a game like that, whereas, and specifically, explicitly so, gamified mechanics.
So
Whereas in Shadow Dark, the players are at the mercy of time.
right.
Time
So
is,
it seems like in Blades in the Dark, time is to borrow a term from Gygax, it's a living part of the game in that you're not necessarily tracking time in a linear fashion.
right. You're right. Yeah, non-linear. There you go. That's the word I was looking for.
So you're tracking it, but it's in such a way that, like, you're essentially, how best to say this? Like, with regard to the Dimmer sisters, if they're trying to get something done, and the characters do something that maybe put a roadblock in their way, unbeknownst to them, then
Right.
you can dial the clock back because it's going to take them longer to get to reach their goal.
Right.
Is that the sort of thing that we're talking about?
Right. You can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you can also nest clocks as well. So, like, let's say that there's a clock during a heist, during a job that is tracking the awareness level of the guards in this manor house or whatever, and then you have one of the players trying to pick a lock, and you can have a clock for picking the lock. Say it's a 4-slice clock, and you can tie the level of the success on that, or the progress on that clock, to how much of an alert level it could generate, like success with a cost, right? If you roll a 4 or 5 or whatever, then if the player gets the clock full all the way in one roll, maybe then it doesn't advance the guard awareness clock at all. But maybe if they take more than one roll to get through the clock, then you increment the guard awareness clock 1 slice or something similar. It's not a very good example, but I think it gets the point across.
It's workable. It's
so. So it's the going back to the idea of crunch and time and focus, I guess. You have to keep in mind that people are putting aside a significant amount of their own personal time in order to play a game. And so if your game is crunching the combat like D&D does, then that's going to, again, you're expanding. Most fights in D&D take in universe time
Mm-hmm.
take about less than 30 seconds almost always.
Oh, for sure.
Like each round is supposed to be 6 seconds worth of time in universe. Well, that can take 4 hours, depending on how complex the combat is and how many
Boggles
players
my
you have.
mind, but yeah.
So your rules light systems are like, why are we doing that? Do maybe one roll and just resolve the combat and figure out who wins, right? And it's whatever you have to keep in mind as you're designing your game mechanics, what it is that you are, what it is that you consider important in this game.
Yes.
So story games, quote unquote, whatever that term means,
nothing to me at the moment. I am unconvinced that they exist.
Well, I would say 10 Candles is a story game. It's absolutely a story game. Again, whatever that means. Still an RPG?
Yeah,
absolutely. It's also an RPG. It's one of the few that I would look at, and if somebody were to say, "Oh, that's a story game," I'd be, yeah, for sure. It's very narratively focused, but time again is a tyrant in that. The time, in order to generate the tension of the horror genre that it is, time compresses. The rounds that you play get shorter and shorter because the players are losing dice from their pool as it goes. And as the candles are blown out, that you're literally taking the ability of the players to dictate the course of events away in increments. They can still do so, but it just becomes less and less common as the game goes. So that's an interesting look at time too, because the first candle is going to last a lot longer than the last one.
Yeah.
So time is not just something that you want to respect for your players, but it's also something where you can induce a particular mood or a feeling as you're playing. If you're going to be running a combat sim and, like, let's say Phoenix Command, where you have mechanics which do things like track bullet windage and all this kind of stuff, then a 5-second firefight can take you multiple sessions to resolve. That would be a very sim-heavy game, I would say, or as close as you can get to a pure simulation RPG as there is, I would think.
Which is just going to be a bunch of spreadsheets,
it's essentially that's what it is. Right? Yeah, the more tables you have and the more math you've got to do.
Yeah.
The more of a simulation it becomes.
Spreadsheet the game, as I like to say.
Yeah, you're playing Spreadsheet the RPG. Excel the RPG. So you want to, and if you want to play that kind of a game, that's totally fine. That's the reason that the game was created, is because a bunch of combat vets wanted to make a combat RPG. Okay, so it's kind of fallen out of favor though, because here's something I'll say that might end up being controversial. I think that not controversy, but I think that a lot of the progression, if you want to call it that, or not progression really, because that kind of tends to imply that things are getting better. I think they're just becoming different. But the progression of game design has trended away from crunchy systems over the last, especially over the last like 10 years. But I think part of that reason is just because it's not so much that people don't have time like they used to in order to devote to their hobbies. People always find time for their hobbies. It's just that we tend to have been trained, especially by things like TikTok and doom scrolling and whatever else, to have less attention on one thing at a time. So it's like, okay, get to the good stuff. Like, give me the resolution right away. And again, that's not a bad thing per se as far as a game goes. It just depends on what you want to accomplish. But I think it also kind of speaks to a lack of patience for sitting there and figuring out all the nitty gritty of what exactly happened within this 6-second span of time, say, or whatever. Exactly right. Okay. So BGD is on that. Right. Of course, BGD is on the same page naturally. Yeah, BGD is awesome. And hey, by the way, anybody who hasn't gone and check out BGD's channel, please do so. It's
Completely agree.
Stuff. So, as you can probably tell, I'm like assembling this as we're talking.
No, that's fine. That's why I wanted to have the conversation, because I do a lot of like this, let's get an idea and sit down and let's see where our emergent thoughts take us.
Right.
And I like that way of I feel like with, when you sit down to explore a topic like this and you do so in a sort of, conversational kind of, you haven't really settled on any sort of ideas kind of a way.
Real-time sounding board.
You tend to be able to be a lot more honest with yourself and with the conversation, which is why I like to do it this way, right? Because
sure.
It sort of, you have an audience to hold you accountable, but at the same time, talking through it like this really keeps you honest with regard to the topic.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. Plus, a real-time sounding board is one of the best ways to develop an idea into something.
Oh, for sure.
Especially because you can get multiple perspectives on it, and I would love to hear what Jax and Ben think about something like this too.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Ben just he sent me a message earlier today about the next time we're going to stream. I don't quite know yet because we haven't actually nailed anything down. I think it might be next Wednesday, so in a week from today.
Okay.
But depending on the topic that he wants to tackle and that Jax wants to tackle, I'm very happy to have a 4-person stream, and we'll just have everyone there together, including you, and we'll see.
That'd be cool.
Very much. I mean, that's ultimately that's where I was headed anyway, right? It's like there's a bunch of people that I'm talking to sort of separately that I'd like to get in the same room together, like with Blaze. And when Jax eventually does do some movie conversations with me, I'd like to get them both in a room with you and Doug to have some. So I don't know what movie we're going to do, but that's the direction I kind of want to bring it in, right? I want to cinch everyone up together.
Yeah. Put it into account.
And like Heath is here in the audience. If he'd love to be a part of that, if he'd like to be a part of that, I'd love to have him.
Yeah, for sure.
So we'll see where that goes. But I agree. I think that Ben in particular would likely have some thoughts about this. I think Jax also has some thoughts about this, especially with regard to how our own game is coming together. We just actually had a conversation earlier today that was very eye-opening, very fruitful. We're kind of going through, and there's these 19 questions to ask with regard to game design and how your game sort of answers those questions. And
interesting.
Yeah, and they're called the Power 19, the question Power 19, and
actually not familiar with that.
Jax found it. Brought it to my attention, and we were like, hey, let's actually hop on a call and start to answer these questions and see, what we are able to answer well and readily, and what maybe we need to shore up a bit. And that's exactly what happened. And it felt really good. It gave us some really solid ideas because obviously there was some stream of consciousness involved as well.
Mhm.
And we recorded the whole thing so that we have it to reference later. So that's kind of how we're headed. This is absolutely a tangent. This has nothing to do with the topic at hand, but whatever, it came up, so I'm talking about it.
Yeah.
So back to time, like,
Yeah.
so with regard to Shadow Dark, which puts you on a timer.
Yeah.
With the torches, and it puts you on a timer with other resources. So you go into the dungeon, you have a torch, you're on a timer. You get out of the dungeon, you go to corrals, you're on a timer because your wealth will dwindle depending on what you do during the carousing stage of the game.
Yeah.
So
Although generally the carousing is
Hmm?
carousing can be as simple as a single roll.
Right.
It's
But
also when I mentioned that Shadow Dark is a game that doesn't waste your time. Stuff happens fast in Shadow Dark.
yes.
Like, yeah, you're on a timer, sure, but
Yeah, it's constantly pushing you forward. And things are happening.
Resolution is not something that takes a lot of math to do, right?
Right. And I think that's like, and that has to do
kind of
with,
the
like you
hallmark
said,
of the OSR.
It has to do with not wasting your time, like you've already said, right? Like I don't know if there was a consideration in the design for not wasting players' time, or if it sort of just grew out of the rules as written, because that's the type of game that Kelsey wanted to put together.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what she put together, and it just so happens that it also doesn't waste your time.
Well, it's a con game. I mean, that's kind of the like a lot of the really interesting, fun games like EZD6 or ICRPG or what have you, like that. Kind of sprung out of the fact that the people who designed them consistently ran games at cons. So
they needed
they need something so they need something that doesn't involve a lot of crunch because it's got to resolve quick. You're doing a one shot in an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours at the most. I don't know. I think probably with scheduled one shots, I can't think of one that would go 3 hours, to be honest, because then somebody else is coming to take the table next. So that kind of approach is get to the. It kind of pares the mechanics down to the bone in a lot of ways. So how can we do something fast? How can we make each time you actually have dice at the table be impactful? I mean, that goes to like something like Mouse Rider says, dice kill player characters, so don't roll them too often. That's kind of a very OSR type of approach, but it's like, if you're rolling combat, you done screwed up. So that's very different than the kind of the super fantasy superheroes that modern D&D has become, where everyone gets excited at the phrase "roll initiative" because we're actually going to do something now with it employs the mechanics of the actual game. And that could be that's probably a whole other discussion about mechanizing social interactions or non-combat stuff, which is something that MCDM is doing with their they call it Draw Steel now, as well as the Broken Empires. I think that DC-20 is also looking at doing that kind of a thing, mechanizing social interactions in the same way as using the same systems as the combat is resolved. I like that approach because it gives equal weight to, and we've talked about this before, there's supposedly 3 pillars of gameplay in Dungeons and Dragons. You got combat, social, and exploration. It's like, no, there's really not.
Yeah, there really is not.
There's one pillar, it's combat, and then
Yes.
social and exploration are kind of, at least in modern D&D,
Exploration is just walking to the next combat.
well, but that's
Social is just talking before the next combat.
you're right. Yeah,
I'm oversimplifying on purpose, but
yeah, but you're not entirely wrong. Like, people don't do hex crawls a whole lot anymore unless you're in the OSR.
right.
So you're it's like you're blowing up. It's like you have okay, here's a good illustration of what your game is about, is whether or not you compress time, which a lot of D&D players do nowadays for travel. And actually, this is something that, for whatever reason, I can never remember his name. Trevor, I think it is, who designed the Broken Empires.
Yeah, Trevor, I think.
Me, Myself, and Die is his channel. It's like, why would you compress time for the travel? Like, getting there is half the fun. So he actually has explicit mechanics built into traveling, and characters being good at travel.
He links that back to his fondness for the One Ring system,
right?
And we've seen that reviewed on Pete's channel, and
Right.
I was very excited. It's actually a really very robust, very interesting travel system where things of significance actually happen en route to your next destination. And so I was very interested, or I was engaged once he started to talk about travel and how he sort of tried to incorporate that sort of design mindset into the Broken Empires.
Goes back to that all caps quote from Gygax that's in your video.
Yeah, I put it in the description.
You cannot have a meaningful campaign if strict time records are not kept. Which he didn't even play his own games that way all the time. But
and what does it mean?
It does make it, like, what is a meaningful campaign? But at the same time, it does make things easier to keep track of in a memorable or a significant way if you know and understand the progression of time. Like, if you're playing your typical 5e campaign and all the travel is compressed time, 3 days have passed in 5 minutes, right? Quick descriptions, and maybe there was a random encounter or not. If it wasn't combat, then the journey is over in 5 minutes or what have you. And then as soon as you get into roll initiative, boom, the timeline expands and you basically enter bullet time because 6 seconds are now going to take you 20 minutes to resolve. Where was I going with that? I'm sure this is a riveting stream for everybody.
Yeah. It's one of those. It's one of those streams where, and I've had these before, where it's like you sit down and you kind of have this stream of conscious conversation. I think my first stream with Jax was like that, and it's like, okay, we feel like we've talked about a lot and accomplished a lot, and everyone in chat is going, "What the
heck are you saying?" Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, but a lot of that too comes from whether or not you're discussing something that you've already been discussing a lot, which obviously you do.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
This is more, we haven't really discussed it in detail yet at all, so we're kind of bouncing ideas back and forth.
Yeah, feeling our way through it.
Yeah, exactly. So, but okay. Now I remember what the point I was going to make with that. It becomes easier to remember. Like, it becomes easier to put yourself into the world and relate to the world if you can feel how much time it has passed. in character. Uh, like your like your typical D&D campaign or Pathfinder campaign or whatever, like your you basically remember it as a string of fights, right?
Yeah, sure.
There can be a story going on about why you're getting into those fights, but that's pretty much where
Yeah, and every once in a
all
while,
the
there's going to be
moments.
that one cool thing that you rolled and succeeded at doing that one time that didn't involve combat, but it's mostly going to be fights.
It's mostly going to be fights, and that I did this cool thing, and what was it? Well, it was in combat, obviously, because that's where all the mechanics are focused. So I think that you need to, if you don't have mechanics for something, then that thing is not going to be memorable in your play, right?
Yeah,
Because
that's possibly correct. I tend to I'm not super big into mechanized social interaction systems because you should be able to just talk it through, right? But the memorable bits come when you were, and this goes back to what Ben was saying with regard to dice and that element of randomness engaging the player more intensely. But if there's something that goes on in a social setting and you have to roll for it and you fail or succeed, whatever the outcome is, it seems to be a more potent, a more intense result. And so applying rules or at least roles to social scenarios looks to be the way to go if you want that engagement. And so I still recoil a little bit when I hear about mechanized social interaction systems, but at the same time, at least now on this side of the conversation that I had with Ben and Jax, it makes a lot more sense to me.
I think that's also part of what people mean when they talk about story games.
Is the mechanization of social interaction or
just non-combat in general?
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Because if all of your mechanics are focused on combat, and you have let's say that the combat is extremely sparse in your game, that may feel like quote unquote less of a game because you're not chucking dice as frequently as you should be, or because it's all social. So yeah, I think there's really a whole lot to explore here, right?
Also keep in mind that essentially whenever dice hit the table, time in the game world stops.
Yeah. It's a meta action. Yeah, it's a meta action rolling dice.
So time stops, and then depending on how long it takes to figure out what the resolution looks like, then that's what people. So again, this is I can't really separate this train of thought that started a few weeks back from the idea that that rules light systems want to refrain from stopping time as much as possible. Stay in the world. So, like,
I mean, this can go back to the foot.
Sorry?
I said sometimes I think they end up shooting themselves in the foot with that regard.
Well, this can go back to the 4D discussion too.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, let's.
But I don't want to interrupt what you were saying.
I was just going to say that, I think that sometimes in an effort to pare down rules to make things more quick, they end up shooting themselves in the foot sometimes because it would likely sometimes you counter in a situation in a rules light game where it would have been better had they given you an action resolution mechanic instead of allowing for the ruling to take place, because that can be just as laboriously time consuming as rolling dice and doing math.
I'm not sure I quite follow.
Okay. let's say we're in a combat situation in a rules light game, and
Mhm.
I say I want to do X based on my skill Y. And
Mhm.
then you tell me, well, as the GM, you're going to be the GM in this scenario. You say, well, I don't think that that necessarily covers this particular action. And then I can argue back and say, well, and we engage in a conversation to resolve this particular situation because I want to use skill X to perform
Right.
action Y.
So it's just very
Meanwhile,
much like a PBTA game.
right, and this is very time consuming, right? It can be very time consuming, this back and forth, right?
Mhm.
Instead of just giving me an action resolution mechanic that says, okay, here's your target number, roll your dice.
Right.
That
Okay.
could be quicker. And so I understand why they attempt to sort of provide this quicker, rules light solution, but I think that it can, depending on the situation, be just as time consuming as rolling a die and doing math, because sometimes the math can get really, really out of control, right? Depending on the game you're playing, the situation that you're in, how many compounded actions there are, it can get involved, right? Oh, what's BGD say? I think in any RPG, the words in social encounters should matter. I agree with that. There can be dice rolls in the resolution, but at my table, more likely than not, they only color the intuitive outcome of the situation. Okay. See, that's generally BGD where I come from. It's like I think that the words in social encounters should matter. And I think that generally speaking, the dice usually color a natural or intuitive outcome. However, like I said earlier with the conversation that I had with Ben and Jax last week, I'm kind of coming around to a different way of thinking. I'm slow, but I'm coming around to a different way of thinking with regard to mechanizing some things that will likely engage players more intensely. Because I think ultimately that engagement, um, it's not the responsibility of the GM to engage the players. It's the responsibility of the players to be engaged. But as the game designer, if you can use human psychology to better engage them through mechanics, I think that that's probably a good way to go.
You're
Right?
talking about a Skinner box.
What's a Skinner box?
A Skinner box? Okay, so Skinner was a guy who looked at Pavlov's experiments and he's like, yeah, okay, you can induce a reaction. Like you can train a reaction to a certain set of stimuli, right?
Okay, yeah.
But what about inducing behavior? Is that possible? So he designed a box with a button in it. He stuck pigeons in the box. Anytime they hit the button, they pecked the button and they got food.
Okay.
And it's like, okay, oh, that's Pavlov's dogs. No, it's not, because they had to make a choice in order to hit the button, right? And that kind of engagement is core to. You actually see this.
Adrian Fuds.
Yes. Okay. Right. This is actually. I was just going to say. Hi, Adrian. It's good to see you. I was just going to say that exact thing, is that Skinner boxes are used in video games all the time because it's a real-time expression of game mechanics. One of the things that Skinner also found was that there you will get you will reach a point of satiety with like this kind of ties back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs as well. You'll reach a point of satiety with the basics of survival, right? Like food and sleep and whatever else. Like you get to a point where when you have enough of those things, you don't want anymore. But things like money or social appreciation, social feedback, social appreciation or social approval, or what have you, those things have no satiety point. And the whole psychology behind Skinner boxes was kind of revolutionary, and has been thoroughly exploited nowadays by things like loot boxes in video games, or the entirety of Las Vegas, right?
So
Um,
how is what I'm describing a Skinner box?
so um, what makes a Skinner box work is the um, the the distribution of a reward in response to an action. But also,
Okay.
what he also discovered was that the action becomes more engaging. The creature, we'll say the person in this place because people are playing the games. The person will engage in the action more, even to the point where the action itself is no longer fun, if the reward is distributed either in a random fashion or on a time scale. So it's like, oh, you've now hit the button. You've hit the button 20 times now. Here's the reward. Now you got to hit the button 20 more times to get the reward.
I don't know
Or
if what I'm
if
describing is a Skinner box then, because
okay,
I don't know if there's a reward associated with it, and this just might be my ignorance, which is fine. I'm
well,
happy.
in RPGs, the reward is the resolution of the action. It's the
If
success or
you view
fail.
if you
That's
view
what
the
the dice are.
resolution of the action as the reward, then
Yeah.
yes, what you're
So when
saying
the
absolutely
dice
applies.
hit the table, that's you're hitting the button in the Skinner box.
Okay.
Now we get to see what comes out.
I don't know if I necessarily equate the resolution of an action to a reward, but it certainly could be. And if that's the way that we're currently
Because
discussing
that's
it, that's fine. That's fine.
when the dice hit the table, time in the game world stops, and that's the point of ultimate tension, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is going to happen? Nobody knows. Like we've just hit the button. Now, what's going to happen? Do we get a reward or do we not? Like, and the reward can be, again, that's part of the game design. Is like, what is the game rewarding? Are you going? And there can be graduated varieties of reward. That's what makes an RPG so engaging, I think.
I don't know. I feel like this is maybe a little bit of an esoteric application of reward. This I think bears a discussion all on its own.
Yeah, you're probably right.
But I can follow what you're saying in the moment, and I'm very happy to just capitulate so that we can keep going with the conversation.
Okay.
I think because, I mean, well, I think that I'm going to write this down because I'd like for this to be a conversation on its own with regard to how games provide rewards. What do those rewards look like? What should we consider rewards as either, game players, GMs, designers? So I would really like to have this conversation. It's actually one of the Power 19 questions that I was talking about earlier. So it's split into two questions. Question number 6 is, what types of behavior styles of play does your game reward and punish if necessary? And then question 7 is, how are behaviors and styles of play rewarded or punished in your game? And so
right.
I think with regard to specificity, you have to have something more concrete than just action resolution, right? But I think that conversation should be had. So I would like to maybe schedule this for a couple weeks out after I maybe get a couple of my thoughts together on this topic so that I can actually come at it, ask questions, make statements, that sort of thing.
Yeah, we're kind of getting more into the psychology of life.
Yeah, we definitely are.
Rather than, and Drudenfoots has some more comments on what Skinnerbox does too.
Skinner boxes are pretty much what is done in all gamification. You train people to do something even if there is no real reward anymore. The reward in a Skinner box is like with a slot machine. Even if you do get nothing, the rush of doing it will often perpetuate people to do it more. Okay.
Right.
I can certainly see how that applies to the conversation at hand.
Yeah. It's again, this is all kind of a big mush. I haven't.
Yeah, which is why, I mean, hey, like I said before, stream of consciousness, we're just gonna go with it and
explore it,
have our conversation. Yeah.
But
I think that to rope this all the way back to what was being said with BGD's commentary and what I was saying about social interaction, how
Right.
generally I tend to prefer the weight of words more to an action resolution mechanic coded into the game system. However, provided the conversation that I had with Ben and Jax, and I have a copy of I can't remember the title of the book in this moment, but Brian Gregory, actually, Stochastic Agency, very graciously
Oh yeah.
had sent a copy of the book to me because I had said last week that I didn't have it. So I have received it. That's going to be the first book that I read from what Brian had given me. And Brian, I thank you so much. I know I've already thanked you probably about 75 times, but I wanted to just thank you again. I'm very appreciative. It was a very kind, very generous thing that you did, and I'm very appreciative. But I will put them to good use, and I do want to read those books because I think that at least this particular one about the random element being used to engage the player more
Mhm.
in the goings on, I think is going to be very eye opening, especially with regard to how I tend to elevate role playing like I do, right? So I have a very 4D approach specifically to role playing in that I want it to be elevated. I want that to be the focus of the activity. But there's a whole lot of academic work out there that I'm not familiar with that could say things like, well, actually, if you break character to do this certain thing, then it engages the player more, which will inherently heighten role play. So, like, I want to really get into this. So while I can sit here and say, well, social interactions should be words, is that really what it should be? Why is that my opinion? Who am I to even issue that opinion? You know what I mean? I'm just some guy on the internet. I don't know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to read what some people who do know what they're talking about have said.
I can. Again, this goes back to the idea. Like I'm not saying you're wrong, but at the same time, also, it's like it goes back to the idea that I mentioned earlier, where um, the important, the things that are memorable are the things where the game system, where you're engaging with the game systems, typically. Um,
Yes.
because we have conversations every day, and whether you're having a conversation in character or not doesn't usually stick in your mind that much.
No, I would say on a day-to-day basis, like a regular, actual living reality kind of a situation, I would say that the conversations I remember the most are the ones that are the most emotional, right?
Right.
Or
Exactly.
impassioned. So
Right.
if I know I'm right when I'm at work and someone is trying to tell me how what I did was not correct or I should have done it another way, I'm going to remember that conversation because I will likely be impassioned in describing how what I know is correct. Or,
Mhm.
if I'm having this conversation here, I'm going to remember this conversation because I enjoy talking about role-playing games. I enjoy discussing this with you. It's a very impassioned sort of a situation and conversation. I'll remember it.
Mhm.
And so there has to be a way, like just your standard, hey, can I have directions? You're not going to remember that conversation. You probably won't even remember what the person you asked looked like, let alone the
Right.
substance of the conversation beyond it got you to where you were going. And so I do think so. Okay, well, here's a question then, right? And this is way off the time topic, but in this sort of scenario, in a role-playing game where engaging with the action resolution system is what becomes most memorable, should then the action resolution system be employed all the time or less? Because not every conversation you have during the day, like you said, is memorable. So it's going to be more true to life if you apply it less, right? Like you can go whole days without a memorable conversation.
Right. Yeah, but that's not why we play a game.
You're not, well, it's not why some people play a game. Some people do play a game to sort of get that simulation just in a different sort of capacity, right? Like I want something that's as true to life as it can be. I just also want to be an elf in a fantastical setting.
Okay. Yeah, but you don't have to play a game to do that. The whole what makes a role playing game a game is the fact that it has mechanics which you're using to represent the response of a the results of your imagined actions in a world that doesn't actually exist. So the dice or whatever resolution mechanic that you're using are designed to represent a separate set of physics, let's call it, a separate set of laws of a different universe than the one that we actually inhabit. And whenever the dice hit the table, all of a sudden, again, like I said, time in that world stops, and everything is balanced on the point of a knife, waiting to see which way it falls. Now I don't know where I was going with that either, and I'm not sure it actually answers what your point was.
That's okay.
Talking about game, I still advocate for dropping such terminology and renaming the hobby to role-playing experience. Well, I mean, but then do you even need mechanics at that point, Hoodenfoots? It's like you can role play in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be in the. If that's the case, like I'm not saying you're wrong, but if that's the case, why do you even need a rule set? A rule set is what gives weight, impact, meaning. I'm not saying that role playing in and of itself is meaningless unless you're using some kind of a resolution mechanic, but it makes it more significant if you don't know ahead of time what the results will be, if that makes any sense.
I see what you're saying. I generally tend toward Drudenfutz's way of thinking here. I usually try to make role-playing games more out to be role-playing experiences. Ultimately, it's an issue of semantics.
Sure.
They are already commonly referred to as role-playing games. They are understood to be role-playing games. The reason that I don't like using the term game is because largely that term by itself usually brings with it an understanding of a win-lose state or some sort of definitive end, maybe point tracking system. And it doesn't always, but it usually does. And I don't think that those win-loss states or definitive ends really exist within the frame of a role-playing game. But that could just be an alternate use of the word game, which, again, it's already in common parlance. It's already commonly understood to mean this thing. So I'm okay using it, but I generally speaking, I agree with you, Drudenfutz. I would prefer, I would prefer that it not be necessarily called a game, but I think that's, at this point, likely a losing battle.
Right.
They're not necessary, but like in creative writing, there are still guidelines and structures one can follow to have an improved outcome. Yes, I want to keep the randomness. I just don't think it needs to be a game. Well, I would be interested then to know what your definition of a game is and how the term experience incorporates these elements that you want to keep. I would be interested to know that. I think it would be an interesting conversation.
I would, yeah. And I'm sure that that's going to be something where you can likely talk with 10 different people and get 10 different definitions as well.
Yep.
But I would say a game is a set of rules that define the type of activity you do in order to achieve a particular goal. So if the goal is, I don't know, if the goal is a memorable horror game, then something like 10 Candles is if the goal is a memorable horror experience, story, whatever you would call it, then a set of rules like 10 Candles will effectively deliver that goal to you. If you didn't want a horror experience, then you would play something with a different set of rules. This in and of itself doesn't have anything to do with time, but
that's okay. Maybe the time for time has expired.
But I still think that's an important thing to think about or to consider in game design is the idea that that whenever you engage with the resolution mechanics, time in that world, in that story, in whatever it is, it stops. And then as soon as the resolution is decided, picks back up again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Rules-like systems tend to want to make that pause as short as possible.
Yes. So your seat at the table mentions Google's definition. That's one of three. So the first definition is a noun, a form of player sport, especially a competitive one, played according to rules and decided by skill, strength, or luck. The second one is a complete episode or period of play ending in a definite result, like a baseball game. And the third is a type of activity or business regarded as a game, such as this was a game of shuttle diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera. So, but the word game, and this is something that Jax has brought up before, it's that you didn't derail the conversation. Don't worry about it at all.
No, not at all. Yeah.
This is not a railroad. I agree. It is nice to see you here, Rick. So thank you very much. But game can, like, Jax likes to mention that game is a very, it is a one moment, I have to clear my throat. Sorry about that. You can have game, right, which means something entirely different. So there are slang meanings of the word game. And game itself is a very, very interesting term. So it can mean a wide variety of things. Generally speaking, if we're going to take the definition here that Rick has provided, that it's a form of play or sport, especially a competitive one, played according to rules and decided by skill, strength, or luck, it doesn't necessarily fit role-playing games because it's not necessarily a competitive activity. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. And so I don't necessarily think that this specific definition captures role-play, right? I will, and this is a hill I will die on, I am not someone who applies the idea of a win-lose condition to role-playing games. I do not think they have win-lose conditions. The example that I like to use...
Why do they have resolution mechanics?
Well, there's a difference between a resolution and a win-lose state, right? And the example I'm going to give is going to be a perfect illustration of that. Reading a book. I can read a book and I can read it through to completion and finish the book. That does not mean I've won the book. Likewise, if I don't finish the book, I get halfway through it and I put it down and I never pick it up again, then I'm not losing the book. I'm just not finishing the book. There is a resolution to the action. It's just not a win-lose resolution. And so not everything is done in terms of win-lose. Additionally, role-playing games are games where characters have personal goals and they have ambitions and they have motivations. None of those things necessarily involve a win-lose condition, even if you gamify something. And further still, they don't have to have a definitive end, which I think is likely essential to a game as it's commonly understood. So, for example, I'll just go back to the reading example. I can read a book or I cannot. I can finish the book. I cannot finish the book. Not a win-lose. I can gamify that, right? And I can say, I want to read 7 books in one summer. Now it's quantifiable, right? But if I don't achieve that goal by the end of the summer, that doesn't mean that I've lost. That simply means that it's a goal that was not achieved. And a goal that is not achieved is not necessarily a win-lose state. On top of that, let's say 3 summers from now, I do follow through and read all 7 books, which means that it's not time-bound at the time that I say this is my goal. So all of these things added together lead me to believe, or at least to espouse the idea that role-playing games are not necessarily games. However, again, I will immediately capitulate that it is in common parlance. There's a common understanding to the term role-playing game. It's just non-standard, right? It is the way that we use the word game to apply to role-playing game is the same kind of way that we use game to say someone has game, or the game is afoot, or a serious game. Like, there are non-standard uses of the word that have very niche applications, and I think that's the case here with role-playing game. I'm going to go to comments now and see.
I'll let the
comments. No. You can go ahead and we can do comments in a moment. I'll start comments and we can get to them in a moment.
Your example, you say, is not time bound, but a game, especially something like Shadow Dark or Blades in the Dark, is time bound. It is specifically, or 10 Candles.
I think that there are elements of it that can be bound by time, but it's not. When I say time bound, I don't mean they endure temporarily. What I mean is that a baseball game is going to last no longer than X hours and X minutes because it's codified in the rules, right? Like a football game is going to last no longer than this amount of time at max, and the teams have these amount of timeouts which last for this amount of time. Like, it is a very specific, codified, called out, time-bound element. And while a role-playing game cannot endure infinitely, the fact that it's not time-bound specifically, I think, is an important consideration in determining whether or not the term game can be applied in the standard way. Again, I think that it's a non-standard way that we use game to apply to role-playing games.
Yeah, but I'm not actually following with that line of thought in so far as insofar as that it's not like just because it's flexible as far as how long it takes to do a thing.
Yes.
Doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that I'll have to think about that. And
sure. I invite challenge. I invite challenge.
Yeah.
This is I'm not trying to be rigid. This is just how I currently view role-playing games. This is why I don't necessarily apply the standard definition of game, and this is really all just in response to Rick, because this is why I don't necessarily apply the standard definition of game to role-playing games, because there are certain things that are understood of the standard definition that aren't necessarily included in a role-playing game, right? And the major one is win-lose state. I think that some people do think that there are win-lose states with regard to killing the big bad evil guy, or what have you. And I think that those arguments can be made, but my perspective is that it's more like, going all the way back to the first video I ever recorded, it's more like litfic. It's more like achieving a personal goal, right? Like, you can destroy the big bad evil guy or prevent the super evil plot from destroying the world, but there's still more after that, right? That's not the end of the role play. There's still more that these characters can and will do. These characters may end up becoming NPCs in a future game. You may continue to stick with these characters and role play them, ad infinitum into the future. Obviously, not infinitely, but with no foreseeable end. So it's just it is the resolution of a particular goal, maybe a personal goal, a party goal, but that doesn't necessarily impart this notion of a win-lose state. And so that's my position. And I know that there are people who do believe that is a win-lose state. And that's totally cool. And that's going to change their perspective on role-playing games. And that's also totally cool. We're just going to have two different perspectives, and that's fine. I'm very happy to have a different perspective.
Sure. It's not. This isn't an argument. This is a.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a conversation. We're just sharing. We're sharing.
Trying to refine ideas.
Yes.
I would say that I don't know why. Okay, let me ask you this: why is a win-lose state so important in order for a game to be called a game for you? Because to me, it doesn't seem like that is a necessary component of a game. A game is just engaging with a particular set of rules, to me.
I think an activity is engaging with a particular set of rules. I think that a game, as it's commonly understood, if you're going to play a game of tiddlywinks, or if you're going to play a video game, there is a win-lose state in a video game. There is, in some video games. It has to do with, and let me go back to the Google definition, if you give me a moment.
I mean, from what you're saying, then a video game like Minecraft is not a game.
I think, it's a video game. It's just a video game as it's commonly understood, right? But game is, you know what? Let's look up video game. What's the definition of a video game? An electronic game that involves interaction with a user interface to generate visual feedback on devices like TV screens or computer monitors. What a boring definition.
That's very technical.
Yeah, it is.
It's entirely correct and entirely useless.
Entirely correct and entirely useless. It's interaction with user interface, generates visual feedback, video display, like TV screen, computer monitor, handheld device. The core of a video game is its mechanics, which define the gameplay. Video games encompass a wide range of genres and styles, from simple puzzles to complex simulations, and can be played on various platforms, including consoles, computers. You know what? With the exception of that platforms bit at the end, that's also role-playing game or tabletop role-playing games, is it not? Right? The core of a role-playing game is its mechanics, which define the gameplay. Role-playing games, not video games, encompass a wide range of genres and styles, from simple puzzles to complex simulations. It's...
you're describing.
I think that we are eternally going to run up against, and I've sort of been attempting to understand role-playing games from a wide variety of perspectives. That's why I ask people what their definition of role-playing and what their definition of role-playing game is. because the idea is to hopefully gain understanding, to see if there's anything standard. There are people out there who will say that the definition of game or role-playing game is necessarily individual, right? But and so I'm not trying to say this has to be broadly applicable. And being challenged on it is important, because I don't necessarily think I have an answer for you in this moment.
Okay.
So I think that I need to take this challenge, really kick it around, ask myself why. Why is this the case? Why do I think that games require a win-lose condition? Because, I'm sure that the reason I did that is because there is a standard definition out there that says, right, just like the Google definition says, and I'll just bring those up again. So the first one is a form of player sport, especially a competitive one. And so I think that might be where it comes from, right? So if it's a competitive sport, there needs to be a measure of the competition. And the most effective way to do that is by point scoring or speed, right? You can go faster than someone, and we're going to record your score. And we're going to record your time, and that time effectively becomes a score, which is a win or lose state, right? If you're scoring something, then there is a win-lose state involved. And so I think inherent to the word competitive, that's where I'm sort of impressing or receiving the impression that there is a definitive win-lose state based on quantifiable scoring systems, right? So, and then in the second one, where it says a complete episode or period of play ending in a definite result, that definite result, again, is speaking to some sort of scoring system. So if you are playing in a baseball game, the definite result is going to be, win or lose. There's no tie in baseball. You go into extra innings. So you have to be able to quantify that definite result. Now, sometimes tie is okay in a sport, but that is a definite result. You have 1 point, I have 1 point. That is the definite result. We tied.
So then, does the fact that a one shot is time bound and has a specific, typically they're a railroad and they have a specific goal for the players to accomplish, does that make them a game?
No, I don't necessarily think so, because I think that it's not an or situation, it's an and situation. So like there has to be a definite result and also a win-lose state. And I just don't think that the resolution of a given story arc or character goal is quantifiable as a win-lose state. I think that it is a resolution. I don't think it's win-lose. And that's my big one, is that it's a win-lose. It can't be a win-lose. Pardon me. It cannot possess a win-lose state.
But if your characters don't get what they want, would that not be a lost state?
No, I don't get what I want all the time. That doesn't mean I lose.
Yeah, but this
just means that the resolution was that, look, I'm going to die one day. That's not what I want, but it's going to happen. And that doesn't necessarily mean I'm losing, right? So I think because this is, okay, so now we're going to get into litfic. Because I view role-playing games very much more litfic than I do genre fic, I view them as very character-driven. And so what that means is that regardless of how their story resolves, their story is still told. So there's humanity in the telling of that story. There is relatability in the telling of that story, but it's not necessarily a win-lose sort of a situation. They may achieve goals during the telling of that story. They may achieve not a single one of the goals that they set out for themselves to achieve, which would probably actually be a pretty frustrating and boring story. But it's still not necessarily a win-lose state. Again, I can 100% see how some people would like to apply a win-lose philosophy to achieving personal goals. I think that there are highly competitive people out there who are likely able to achieve their goals because they view it as a win-lose, because they don't like to lose. I'm not going to lose, so I'm going to apply myself and I'm going to make sure that I win, quote unquote, by passing the bar, by achieving magna cum laude in my university, by making sure I get the promotion based on, a track record. Like, you can definitely view it as a win-lose situation. And I get that frame of thinking. I just don't apply that to role-playing games.
Okay.
And I can't answer the why in this moment. So that is something I'm going to have to think about and get back to you on.
Okay, that's fair.
But now going to the comments.
Yeah, there's a lot of comments now.
Yeah, we're going to start way up here. I'm always up for some bacon late at night. I appreciate that. I am always happy to have you here.
Everything's better with bacon.
Yes, or at least this channel is. So Rick and Drudifus talking about role-playing experience. Rick says, Google's take on RPGs, a game in which players take on the roles of imaginary characters who engage in adventures, typically in a particular computerized fantasy setting overseen by a referee. Interesting. The word computerized is interesting. I don't know necessarily what's meant by computerized. And you can poke holes in this definition too, right? So it's like a game in which players take on the roles of imaginary characters. It doesn't have to be an imaginary character. I can be myself in the role of Paladin, or myself in the role something. So it doesn't have to be an imaginary character, who engage in adventures. Don't necessarily have to go adventuring anywhere. Maybe I'm just busy doing the day-to-day, custodial maintenance of the temple that I am a priest at. Typically, in particular, computerized fantasy setting overseen by a referee. Doesn't necessarily have to be fantasy. Don't know what's meant by computerized, but so see, you can like poke holes in this definition as well. So I don't necessarily know if Google is the best place to go and get these definitions.
That sounds like it's generated by their AI, their large language
Yeah, I would agree. I think that there's definitely some common elements here, right? Like, you definitely take on a role. I think that is absolutely a common element, regardless of who's giving you the definition. I think that you definitely engage in activities. It doesn't necessarily have to be adventures, but you engage in activities, usually in an imagined space. And it's probably typically fantasy. Like, there are a lot of sci-fi games out there. There are a lot of modern set games out there, but it's probably typically fantasy. So, like, I think there's a lot of commonality you can find here in this definition, but I don't know if it's adequate. In fact, I would probably say it's not. But that's just me. And, I'm not everybody, and I'm not an authority. So. Trudenfoot says, all the things you talk about, like narrative resolutions, characters, and so on, are all true for plenty of media who also are not games. Yes, that is correct, and I agree with you for sure. Don't forget big game hunting. True, game can also be, game.
Large animals.
Yes. I think there has been baseball games that went on for days before it was codified how long they can be. You're likely correct. And it may, as a result, be an imperfect example. But I think the example was still well applied and understood. Maybe I need to work on bringing up a different example than baseball. But I think that it served the point in the moment. But anyway, I would call baseball and the like sports and not games, even though they are certainly much closer to games than our role-play hobby. Very interesting. I would like to think about this myself.
Well, you can...
Because...
Yeah, that's
very interesting
in so far as the activity of baseball or football or whatever is a sport, but you engage in that sport within you play games of that sport. So a game is when that activity is specifically engaged in, as agreed by all the participants, right? All participants come together to engage in that sport.
Right, but when you say it that way, it very much sounds like a role-playing game.
Right. So that is actually kind of it's like, okay, here's a particular time we're all going to get together to play
Exactly.
this,
We're going to play for this amount of time.
this sport. So our so the role-playing sport, let's say, the hobby of role-playing, we call it a hobby. Maybe it's more like a sport. And then everybody gets together to play a game of that hobby, of that sport.
And then sport is like, sport's also a weird one because sport doesn't necessarily have to involve a win-lose condition, right? Unless you are specifically engaging in a sport that does. Big game hunting is a sport.
Mm-hmm.
If you go big game hunting, you are engaging in the sport of big game hunting.
Skiing.
If you are unable to track and shoot anything, does that mean you lose? Is that a win-lose state? I might not consider it a win-lose state.
Unless you have to get that game so you don't starve.
Right. Well, that could definitely be a loss of a sport. But unless you apply a competition to it. So if I am hunting or skeet shooting, if I'm just out there skeet shooting on my own, it's a sport. I'm engaging in the sport. If I'm now competing against someone else, that's an entirely different thing, right? The competition, there's a layered element of competition, and that competition is what requires the win-lose state.
Okay.
But engaging in there's a lot more thought that I need to put into this, I think. So I appreciate the challenges and I appreciate the questions. I need to think this through a little bit further.
Yeah.
Drudenfuss then says, roleplay is, in the end, heavily gamified storycraft. I think that I generally agree with that, but it's also... I need to think about this before I say one way or the other. I need to sit down and sort of dissect what's meant by storycraft and really kind of kick this around a bit. But I see where you're coming from, and I think it's a perfectly valid view. Rick then says, I think that time becomes more important the longer we play. We want our time to matter more than we did as kids. This is 100% true.
Mm-hmm.
This is 100% true. It's just a fact of being a human
Going
person.
Going back to the start of the conversation, I think that's one of the reasons the Shadow Dark was such a smash hit.
Yes. Yep. Yes.
It respects the player's time. What you do matters because it's bam, resolved quickly. Next thing, right?
Yes.
So,
agree. Trudenfo is technically correct. It is the best kind of correct. Rick says, I've yet to find a video game that can hold a 10-foot pole to a pen and paper game. I think I have an opinion one way or the other on this. I don't know if I have an opinion one way or the other on this.
Depends on the type of experience you want, I would say.
Yeah, it depends on the experience. I think much like engaging in role-playing, it really depends on the experience you're going for, right?
If you're talking about computer role-playing games, then I would generally say that I agree with that. But there are some which are incredibly... But it's a very different activity, though. It's typically, even in a computer RPG, you're not playing with other people. You can. Yes. You could be playing Neverwinter Nights, which still has servers that still run GM'd games in that engine, right?
Yep.
But for the most part, video games, well, I don't know. Like the Forever Winter, for example, that just came out into early access a week ago now or something.
Yeah, you were
or a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
It's a cooperative game, so you can play it solo, just like you could play RPGs solo. But it's designed to be a better experience if you're playing with other people at the same time. It's incredibly evocative as far as mood and tone and feeling goes, and putting you into a fantasy world. it has all the same kind of has all the same kind of trappings, I guess you could say, as your as far as the type of activity you're engaging with.
Mhm.
It has, and it doesn't necessarily like it doesn't necessarily have a win-lose state. Like you can, if you run out of water, then you lose, quote unquote, all the um, access to all the vendors and gear and whatever else that you were able to accumulate. But that doesn't mean you can't just start again.
Yeah.
You can play it as long as you want, just like you could with a role-playing game. So,
Yeah, I see. I think
like
that when I
it ticks
sit
all
down,
the same boxes.
it does. But when I sit down, and this goes back to the experience thing, right? Like when I sit down to play a video game, I'm not comparing it to, like, I don't sit down and play a video game and go, man, I really wish this was a pen and paper RPG, because that's not the activity that I've sought to engage with, right? So I guess it just never really crosses my mind. Now, again, if we're going to talk about RPGs, computer RPGs versus
Right.
tabletop RPGs, there's probably a book I could write about that with how much I have to say, right? But
So
even then, like
is the
there are
emergent
times
story?
where I would prefer to engage with the video game, right?
It seems like the emergent story then is a crucial part of the RPG experience.
Yes, with that I
Yeah,
certainly agree. Yes,
but
yes,
then okay, yeah,
but and so like with the computer RPG,
that's one of the things that makes games like Dwarf Fortress or RimWorld so engaging,
yeah,
right?
yes, but like let's say I sit down to play Baldur's Gate
Mm-hmm.
3. There are a wide variety of different choices that I can make, but they've all already been accounted for. So everything in that game is set in stone. However, because I can choose to roll a human bard or an elf wizard or whatever I want to roll at the beginning of the game, there is a very strong illusion of an emergent story, even though all of my choices have already been accounted for. It's all codified, it's all written, it's all a matter of fact. It's all contained within the code, and it will never be able to show you anything outside what's in the code.
Mm-hmm.
But the illusion of an emergent story is strong enough. It's a whole, like, see, and this is one of the reasons why I don't really want to talk about computer role playing games on the channel, right? It's because I feel
Yeah.
like they are a force unto themselves. They introduce a whole other element. I do love video games, but I think that discussing them in this same category with tabletop role playing games is it's well, the next comment is language is a mess, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's largely what we're going to run up against. Um, and so I it's definitely something to think about. It's definitely something to consider. Um, I'm just not quite there with the channel where I want to introduce, and it's kind of sort of bleeding in anyway, right? Like Ben has been bringing up video games. We have video games being brought up here in chat. This is not the first time that video games have come up. You've mentioned video
Yeah.
games before in our private conversations. It's like it is it's an intrusive part of the conversation for sure. It's present, it's there. I can see it. It's bearing down on me, and I'm staring at it like a deer in the headlights, but I'm going to try and hold off for as long as I possibly can. Rick says, most people haven't a clue what they think roleplay is in relation to RPGs as a whole, and most of us who do have wildly differing opinions on the answer. I would say that there is a definite diversity among definitions, and I think that largely speaking, individuals will hold individual definitions.
I think I've come up with a pretty good one. I'm going to hold off on it until Jackson And
Oh, okay, yeah. Let's,
and
I love that. Would be an awesome conversation to have with them.
And it was actually it really crystallized after your latest stream with them, by the way.
Oh, well, good.
They're kind of responsible for it.
I am positive they're very interested in that discussion. Not to speak for them, but they would be interested. I'm nearly positive. So I'm not necessarily at odds with the idea that most people have different definitions, right? Which is kind of what's prompting my. I want to sort of develop this common ground. I want to know what people's definitions are. I want to know how they are all alike. They're obviously going to be different, but I think there are some core elements which can establish, again, a lens, not a definition. And I think it will provide sort of a foundational understanding of what people mean when they say role-playing. Maybe it won't. I don't know, but we're not quite at the end yet, so we'll see when we get there. Rick then also says, where in my opinion things started to get fuzzy was back in the 70s when Gygax and friends found their war games lacking in personal or intimate actions and their interactions. So it was fuzzy from the get. I agree with that. I think it was very fuzzy from the jump. I think this is 100% correct.
Yeah.
Drudenfud says, our hobby had early on these tournament modules. Our hobby had early on these tournament modules that people played in such a competitive manner. I think that's where we get the label game for our hobby. You know what? I would bet that that's likely an organic outcrop of that exact thing. I would not be surprised to learn that that's true.
Well, I mean, possibly, but it can, the game chainmail was what's commonly now called today a skirmish game, right? It was a little combat tabletop game.
Right. It wasn't a war game. It was a skirmish game. War games are much different. War games can be played on paper without miniatures. Skirmish games usually required the miniatures.
Right. Which, what's the name of the classic, like the first war game? I forget what it's called.
First war game? I don't know. In fact, you told me that, and I don't remember.
And I can't, for whatever reason, I'm spacing the name of it right now.
I don't remember what the name of the war game is. You've given me links on that, though.
But you could almost say that that's the type of role playing game in its own right, because the players are taking on the role of the generals of each of the sides.
Yeah.
So
Rick says, clearly D&D still has a war game foundation. Regardless now, many editions they crank out saying...
How many editions?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, reality is reality, right?
Yeah. It's never going to get away from that DNA.
Yeah, obviously. Never ever. And yet, I have long told would-be players that the only way one loses in an RPG is to quit playing. Even character death promotes play.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't call it a loss by them quitting playing, but I completely agree with the sentiment. This is a response to Rick. It's become very popular to play D&D not as a war game, but for narratives. That's why shows like Critical Role are so popular. I would say that that's accurate. People simply do not want a game. Okay, some want, but I think the majority does not. I don't know.
I can't. I think I understand what Verdenfoots is saying by that. I don't think I can agree, though, because, again, to me, if you're not using a rule set to dictate having restrictions is what promotes creativity. And the rule set is what defines your I'm all of a sudden starting to think about how that ties back to time.
Well, we can certainly circle back at the end once your thoughts are complete, for sure.
Let me go ahead and put a pin in that.
Okay. Rick says, I suspect that Google's definition is leaning on the video game versions of RPGs. I would say, based on the definition provided, yes. Especially with that word computerized in there, but that could just mean, that could just mean some programmatical math for action resolution. Like, I don't understand what they meant with that term, but I would say it likely leans video gamey. Hey, Robert, I didn't even see you come in. Hello, how are you?
Yeah.
It says, you assume the role of a character who has the ability to interact with other characters and manipulate the environment with rules. You assume the role of a character who has the ability to interact with other characters and manipulate the environment with rules. Yes, that would be an accurate definition of role-playing game as it's commonly used. There, however, may be more to it than that, but everything stated here, you assume the role of a character who has the ability to interact with other characters and manipulate the environment with rules. All of that is true and accurate, and I don't think you can really poke holes in any of those elements as they apply to role-playing games. That's actually quite good. Drunfoot says, I still would not call the sports meeting a game, but the context it happens in as a match. Okay. Rick, the win-lose state can be relative to the individual's view on sport or game being pursued. Consider how often we lose while playing games, and yet we see that as part of the enjoyment. I wouldn't call it lose, but now I feel like I'm maybe being a little too stickler.
Pedantic.
Yeah. Okay, yes, I see what you're saying. I wouldn't use the word lose. And I find, honestly, that most of the games where I am expected not to survive or remain sane, the most engaging. Those are the games that I have the most fun with. But I wouldn't call it a loss, right? Especially if that's my goal. If my goal is to die or go insane by the end of a game, and I meet that goal, then it changes maybe your perspective on lose in that situation. Video games as games certainly can be better games than what we get in role play, but the narrative aspects of our hobby, those suffer in video games for sure.
Right.
Because it's all already pre-decided, right? Like once it's put in the code and the game is stamped and out there, you can't even, you can never, you can update the code, right? Like you can provide additional choice outcomes and you can provide additional content through downloadable means, but you can never account for, I will never, ever, never be able to choose anything I want in a video game. I will only be able to choose from whatever was previously decided by the developer. I will never, ever be able to say, well, I want to do this and it's not accounted for in the code, but since I want to do it, I can do it anyway. That's never going to happen. Rick, again. As of yet, video games cannot match the human mind. Think of all the times when someone at the table does something that ought not work, yet does spectacularly. True.
I think that's probably the big draw behind the hobby in the first place is all of the different motivations and what have you bouncing off of each other. And
yeah, I would agree. I would certainly agree with that.
That's mostly explained.
I do play DF a lot. I don't know what DF is.
Dwarf Fortress.
Oh, okay. I do play Dwarf Fortress a lot, mostly because it's a builder game, because I don't have to think all that much, but I wouldn't want to play a TTRPG in that manner. Oh, for sure. BGD, the best computer RPG has more in common with a jigsaw puzzle than it does with a tabletop RPG.
Which one's the best?
Yes, it's how best to solve the puzzle. I get what you're saying. I don't disagree.
I would say the best computer RPG is Planescape Torment, and I don't know that it fits that definition.
Well, then it would be a conversation.
Yeah. Have you played Planescape Torment?
Oh yeah, I love Planescape.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'd say to me that's like the tip top of what you can do as far as the strength
Yeah,
of
I
narrative
think-
in a video game.
I think that is a worthy challenge to BGD's statement here. But even still, I think it would be a conversation. I think that it would be a conversation because I can see it from both sides because of the codified nature of the video game, right?
Mhm.
It's just,
Mhm.
it is the code. It is only the code. You cannot push past the code. And because of that reality, I can certainly see what BGD is saying applies. But because it's Planescape, I think that it's a worthy challenge to the statement.
Yeah.
Okay. Rick looks like having a conversation in chat. Robert, I'm talking with Rick. All right, so Trudenfud says, I would say the origin of our hobby lies with Braunstein, and I don't think that was called a game back then. I think that it is a contributor to the origin of the hobby for sure, but it's on the shoulders of war games, right? So I think Braunstein started to tip the scale in a different direction.
Yeah. Braunstein, if Braunstein wasn't called a game back then, what was it called?
Yeah, that's
I don't know if you know that. I don't know if that's like, I don't know that. I'm just genuinely
Yeah,
asking.
no,
What
a
was it
genuine
called?
question. Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't have an answer, and I would be interested to know as well. Rick says agreed, and that may be why the Braunstein rules quickly were set aside by the majority. That's a very good possibility.
But I mean, the original Braunstein was almost ended up playing out like a game. Here we go again of diplomacy, right? Is diplomacy a game? That's much more like a role playing game in a way.
Well, see, here's the thing, right? Braunstein had points, right? You would acquire victory points, as was typical and standard in war games of the day, or skirmish games of the day. You would acquire victory points, and then I believe the victor was the person who had acquired the most victory points by executing their activities, their the list of things that they could accomplish the most effectively, which was measured in victory points. I'm not 100% solid on that. I do know that there are stories in interviews with Dave Arneson, and he does talk about points. Like, he talks about playing Braunstein, and there were points, and so you would acquire these points, and then you would measure a victory by points. So it does have a win-lose condition. Is that enough to call it a game? I don't know. To some people, I'm sure it would be. I would call it a game, but possibly not everyone. Trudenfuzz then says, improv theater has rules, even though they're mostly social contracts. So the role play experience can have rules without having to be a game. Yeah, and this is one of the major reasons why I like to separate the definition of role play from role playing game. You can role play and not be in a role playing game. There are a wide variety of situations where you can role play and not be in a role playing game. Okay. So here's an answer to your question. Rick says, yes, diplomacy is a game. I have it, and it's similar in concept with Braunstein, which I'm told is still being ran at conventions by its creator. As far as I'm aware, it is. I think the most recent one was even last year, and Ben from the Questing Beast has a really, really great, short, but really great video on his experience with playing it. So I would encourage you to maybe look that video up. But
I don't think I've seen that video.
David Wesley, he is still going to cons and still running his games. And we're told that rules, like an actual book of rules is in the works. And I believe it's with the Blackmore Foundation. I do not know for sure. If I am misspeaking, I apologize, but I think that it's the Blackmore Foundation that's in communication with Wesley to see if they can get a book written to sort of publish and put out there. Drudenfoot says diplomacy is a game, but Brownstein allowed weird approaches that went way outside the box to make it more of a LARP. I am just not familiar enough with diplomacy, but what Drudenfoot is saying about Brownstein is correct. In fact, for that reason, the first Brownstein, Wesley largely considered it to be a failure because he didn't like that people were like, because he was the referee.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea was that he was going to adjudicate all of these interactions between players. But players were like, nah, we don't need a referee. We can just agree to things between ourselves. If you do this for me, I'll do that for you. And so Wesley considered that to be a failure. He then adapted the rules to say, okay, now these are the only things that you can do in a game given this particular role, but you always have to go through the referee. And the players largely considered that a failure.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting development of this particular game. The history of it is incredibly interesting. I find it to be incredibly interesting, and you know, I do hope that we eventually get some sort of rules book from Wesley himself. I think that would be fantastic. And then finally, last comment for the moment. It is most definitely a LARP, as it's ran by its creator. There are YouTube videos showing him running the game. I wouldn't consider it a LARP necessarily, but that's because I think that LARP doesn't necessarily take place in an imagined setting, right? Like you are physically in a location, and you may be imagining that location is different than it is in reality. So there is an imagined element, but you're still at someone's house, or you're still occupying a physical space
out in the woods.
Right. So like I think there's more to it than that, I think. Anything else about time or role playing or any of this stuff?
Let's see.
I think this was a great stream, by the way. I thank you very much for
I appreciate that.
The idea. Like you were the one who brought the idea of this whole time as a resource and time really being what you're manipulating as a game designer to affect the experience at the table was all you. Absolutely brilliant. And that's why I immediately wanted to have a stream about it, because I wanted to hear more, even if hearing more just meant, talking it through and seeing reach a logical conclusion.
I don't know how brilliant it is yet.
I think every stream that you've been on has been just awesome.
Oh, thank you.
So I'd love to have you on more. Like I said, Ben is talking about a stream next week. I do not know if Jax is available next week. They did mention that it might be a bad week. So it may just end up being Ben and you and I, if that's the way it ends up going.
Okay.
But we'll see, because it's literally just a message I just received before we started streaming. So I haven't even talked back and forth with Ben or Jax yet. So
I really enjoy talking about these things with you, so I'm happy to do it. And between the meeting of the minds, I'm sure we'll come up with something that's brilliant. I feel like that when it hit me, it was like one of those switches goes off in your head, and you're like, oh wow, that's a deep insight. And then I started trying to unpack it. I'm like, yeah, but what does it actually mean? So
I encounter that quite a bit.
but I do think it's something to really keep in mind about. I think it's probably a key into why some games would succeed where others don't.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very crucial to the success of things like Shadow Dark or Blades in the Dark or similar games. Thanks, BG.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Thank you, everyone, for
and thank you everybody in the chat for
chat participation out of this world. Thank you so much.
good insights and thoughts and what have you. I mean,
Yep,
that just keeps
always.
us bouncing around.
Always super happy to see all of you here. Always very happy to have participate, and it's a good time. So I thank you all. Is there anything else? Anything more that you wanted to talk about?
What was it that I was putting the pin in with Drudenfutz's comment? I forget. It was something about
time.
There was something about rules, and I was like, how does that relate to time?
Yeah, please do. By all means, if there's something you want more info on, or if you want to start a conversation off with,
sure,
toss it up in Discord. I'm happy to participate.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything with a solid thought or insight that we haven't touched on yet. So that's
awesome. I'm sure this is developing, so I'm sure we will touch on this again in the future, which I'm very excited to do. Sable Phoenix, TPR, the Titterpig Rancher, I thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your thoughts.
Thanks for having me, as always.
Of course. Just the whole conversation, the challenges that you issue to my particular way of thinking are very, very important. I'm very thankful for those, because sometimes it really is just a matter of me going, oh, well, I don't know. And I need to think about it a bit further. So thank you again, chat. Thank you. And I'm going to click end stream here.
Have a good night, everybody. Please like.
Oh, thank you. Also, TPR, I every time he's on, I link his channel.
Which still has nothing on it yet.
Right. It doesn't have anything on it yet, but it is in the works, and I'm sure that he would appreciate the membership. So go ahead over to him and sub, and we'll catch us all next week, I think, right? I don't have anything scheduled for this Sunday, but next Wednesday for sure.
This Sunday didn't you put this Sunday up for Dragon Snare?
No, that's 2 Sundays. Yeah, that's 2 weeks from now. If I didn't put it up, then I just would have forgotten. So I got it up as soon as I could. Okay. That's not this Sunday, that's next Sunday, or the following Sunday.
Okay.
All right, everyone, take care. Thank you so much.
Have a good night, everyone.